In 1976, two Stanford graduates named Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started Apple Computer Inc. in a garage in Jobs' parents' house with a third lesser-known partner named Steve Gates. The first product was the Apple I, a computer kit that sold for $400. Just like that, the journey of one of the most valuable companies in the world began. For many years, Apple was just another Silicon Valley tech company trying to make it big. It wasn't until the late 80s when things really took off with the launch of the Macintosh. The iconic commercial showing a scientist sitting down after being frustrated by his colleagues, pushing a button and saying hello to the Mac, changed the way people saw computers forever. After all, it was the first mass-produced personal computer with a full-fledged graphical user interface. But while the Mac was revolutionary, it was also expensive at $2,500. As a result, only universities, businesses, and well-off hobbyists could afford it. And so what happened? IBM released the IBM PC, which cost half as much. This was a huge blow to Apple, who had to lower the price of the Mac to $39 just to remain competitive. To make matters worse, Microsoft came out with Windows, which was basically a cheaper version of the Mac. So at the end of the day, Apple was left with nothing but its operating system, something that nobody wanted. Luckily, Jobs managed to convince some investors to fund the development of a cheap version of the Mac called the Macintosh, say 30. But even though this new Mac cost half as much as the original one, it still required a separate monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse, not to mention that it was pretty slow compared to other PCs at the time. In the meantime, Windows started gaining market share at an unstoppable rate, while Apple was about to file for bankruptcy. At this point, Jobs knew that he had to make a drastic move. In 1991, he unveiled the PowerBook, which was Apple's very first portable computer. Granted, there were a few portables before this, such as the Osborne one, the Grid Compass, and the Dell 320, but none of these were as advanced or as polished as the It featured a 9.1-inch black and white display, a 33 megahertz processor, and a starting price of $2,500. Sure, it was more expensive than the competition, but it had a few tricks up its sleeve that made people forget about the price. You see, the PowerBook was a beautiful machine with a magnesium alloy shell and a full-size 101-key keyboard. Back then, most laptops had small keyboards that were barely big enough to type on. Plus, the PowerBook screen was so thin that Apple was able to include a trackball right below it. Most laptops either didn't have a trackball or they had to sacrifice screen real estate in order to fit one. But perhaps the coolest thing about the PowerBook was its battery life. While most laptops could last around 10 to 15 minutes without being plugged in, the PowerBook could last up to 2 hours. This was thanks to a clever trick that Jobs played. Instead of going with a powerful but short-lasting lithium battery, Jobs went with a nickel-cadmium battery, which lasted twice as long but drained performance by 50. Either way, the PowerBook became a hit immediately, selling over 100,000 units in its first year. Although the second PowerBook model that came out in 1992 was not as popular, Apple soon bounced back with the PowerBook 300 series. Not only did these computers come with faster processors and larger hard drives, but they also had color screens, something that the original PowerBooks lacked. This turned out to be the perfect upgrade that Apple needed. Between 1993 and 1997, Apple sold over 3 million PowerBooks worldwide. With this success, Jobs returned to Apple in 1996 after 11 years away from the company. He fixed the issues with macOS, introduced the iMac, and turned the company around from a loss of $1.4 billion to a profit of $1.3 billion. All in all, Jobs' return to Apple proved that brand loyalty is real, because if he hadn't fixed macOS, there's a chance that the iMac wouldn't have sold as well. Similarly, if the iMac hadn't sold well, Jobs would have never been able to introduce macOS 10, which led to the introduction of the MacBook in 2006. Now, Jobs wanted to capture a portion of the ultra-affordable laptop market. This time, though, he didn't want to sacrifice too much on specs for the sake of affordability. You see, while the cheapest Windows laptops of the time, such as the HP Pavilion, Dell, Inspiron, and Toshiba Tecra were selling for under $1,000, the cheapest MacBook model cost $1,300. That's why when the MacBook Air came out in 2008, it caused quite a stir. The MacBook Air was easily the thinnest and lightest laptop on the market. It weighed just 2.96 pounds, which was almost half as much as the 13-inch MacBook. Also, its design was absolutely gorgeous, with an aluminum finish and a midnight blue color. Plus, it had a 13-inch glossy LED display and a 1.86 gigahertz Core-Duo processor. All in all, the MacBook Air seemed like the perfect machine, especially since it started at just $1,500. But there was one problem. Even though the MacBook Air was thinner and lighter than the Asus EPC, it cost $1 more than the most expensive version of the EPC. So it's no wonder that the sales of the MacBook Air were underwhelming. In the first quarter of 2008, Apple sold 110,000 MacBook Airs, whereas they sold 370,000 13-inch MacBooks. Of course, this doesn't mean that the MacBook Air was a failure. After all, it's still being produced to this day. But it's safe to say that it didn't live up to the hype. Fortunately, Apple was able to bounce back in 2010 when they released the Air 2. Unlike the first Air, the Air 2 was significantly cheaper, starting at just $999. It also featured an 11.6-inch LED display, an Intel Core i7 processor, and up to 12 hours of battery life. These upgrades made the Air way more competitive. But once again, the real magic happened when Apple launched the 11-inch MacBook Air in 2015. The 2015 model came with a razor-thin 3mm design, a large 12-inch Retina display, and a Force Touch track. It also marked the end of an era, as it was the last MacBook with a built-in optical drive. But despite all of the cool new features, the 2015 MacBook Air was plagued with a major flaw. You see, the new 12-inch Retina display was so thin that Apple had to use a panel that was coated with a reflective layer. This made the screen look gorgeous, but it made typing on the keyboard nearly impossible, especially under any kind of ambient lighting. To make matters worse, the keyboard was already narrow to begin with, so using the arrow keys felt like a chore. On top of that, many users reported that the butterfly switch keyboard had a high failure rate, possibly due to dust or food particles getting trapped inside. By 2017, it was clear that the MacBook Air was in desperate need of a refresh. The main improvements with the 2018 model were the larger keyboard, the better battery life, and the upgraded internals. Even though the 2018 model looks identical to the 2015 model, these three changes made a world of difference. First, the larger keyboard allowed for full-size function keys, a Touch ID button, and a power contact switch. Second, the battery life increased to 13 hours, which was more than enough to get through a full workday. And third, the internals got a massive boost. The previous Intel chips were replaced with Apple's own M1 chip, which was 2.5 times faster and used up to 90% less energy. All in all, the 2018 MacBook Air was a substantial improvement over the 2015 model. However, it was still thicker and heavier than the competing ultra-portable laptops. But as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. While some people value having a super-thin laptop, others don't mind sacrificing a few millimeters for performance and battery life. So, how thin is too thin for a laptop? Well, that depends on your priorities. Personally, I think the sweet spot for thickness is between 6 and 8 millimeters. This is because I hate touching reflective surfaces, so I always use a sleeve or a case anyway. And even though a thinner laptop would be nicer to carry around, it wouldn't really make a difference for me. On the other hand, if you prioritize having the thinnest laptop, then you probably don't care about the build quality or performance either way. Take the LG Gram. For example, at just 1.24 millimeter stick, it's one of the thinnest laptops on the market, but it's also one of the heaviest 14-inch laptops. Also, it gets bad reviews for its poor build quality and mediocre performance. So what do you think? Is the MacBook Air the perfect laptop? Comment that down below.